and I think we should begin. People are joining us. We've got a lovely group. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this morning. We have, it's now afternoon officially, I think. We've got an incredible panel, and we actually discussing incredibly. Just you, I'm going to continue. Okay, we've got an incredible panel here today, and despite the general negative outlook for pretty much the world at the moment, I think that today's webinar is really one that I think should give us a lot of hope and inspiration, which is something I think we could all really use a massive big dollop of with extra cream. And all the more so because it's one of our own documents. It's one of our continental documents that is something we can all be immensely proud of. We've got, as I said, some incredible speakers. It's an all-women panel. I'm just here to do hellos, and then Samkelo will do the greeting at the end, or rather the farewell and the thanks. But we've got Advocate Panji Tlakula, who is commonly known to many of us as the information regulator within that particular office. She's going to speak to us. And then we've got Justine Limpetlaw, who is a media lawyer, among other things, and also been intimately involved in the development of this particular declaration. And we've also got Zoe Titus joining us from what I'm sure and I hope is a lovely, warm, beautiful day in Windhoek in Namibia, and she's the director of the Namibian Media Trust. Sorry, let me not ignore that organization, which does amazing work in Namibia. And we also have Avni Singh, who is known to us on a range of levels, and she's a brilliant technology lawyer, and I think her camera just fell off or something, or she just disappeared. But oh no, there you are, you just moved screen. Sorry, it's as this thing changes, it moves along. So, and she's with Alt Advisory, and we've also got Duruetsang Makuse, who I hope many of you also know is with SOS. She's the coordinator for the SOS Public Broadcast Support Public Broadcasting Coalition. So this declaration that we're talking about, a number of us have been able to be lucky enough to give some input into it, but all of the speakers today have really excellent knowledge of it, and we needed to get them all together because it's such an incredible and broad-ranging document. And with that, I'm going to move on to our first speaker, who's going to be Advocate Panji Tlakula. She's going to chat to us for a little bit about it, and then we'll move to Justine, and then we will have our panel input from Avni and Zoe and Duruetsang. And as we go along, please send us your questions. Sorry, I can't multitask. The moment I try and read the chat, I stop thinking. So please send us your questions on the chat, and we will ask them. You can either send to everyone, or you can send to the people that are directly, but it's probably a good idea to send it either of the hosts, which is either myself or our MMA person, and we will then try and get those questions answered right without any more delaying from my side. Advocate Tlakula, if you can take us away, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I think this is an important day, considering that yesterday was World Press Freedom Day, and we are continuing to commemorate that day today with the discussion of this important document. I was privileged because I was a member of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and the expansion of the previous declaration started during my tenure as the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information. And we decided that it was important to update the declaration that was adopted in 2002, that is the previous one, to factor the developments that had taken place over the years in the field of freedom of expression and access to information. So we updated the declaration, or we started that process. And if you look at the declaration in its current form, which was spearheaded after I left by my successor, Lawrence Mute, who became the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information. The declaration as it stands now, I think incorporates important access to information principles, and it is now in line with the model law on access to information, which is important so that we don't have two documents that are not complementary. And as far as ATI is concerned, I think what is important is to highlight the fact that the declaration talks about or promotes proactive disclosure of information. I think that is important. It has a primacy clause. It also applies, makes access to information applicable to relevant private bodies. I think that is quite important, taking into consideration that in most of our countries, services are delivered by private bodies.
Sorry, Advocate, sorry to interrupt you, but
yes.
we just can't see you at the moment. We're looking at your shoulder.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, please continue.
Yeah, it's the way, the table that I'm using. So sorry about that. And it also establishes oversight mechanism, independent oversight mechanisms. Section on access to information on the internet. I think that is a very important section, particularly at this point in time, because that section says that states must recognize that a universal, equitable, and affordable access to the important for the enjoyment of the right to freedom of expression, access to information, and other human rights. And I think at this point in time, when we are dealing with issues of working remotely, when schools have not opened and our children are being taught remotely, the issue of universal and affordable, equitable access to to the internet are quite important. And my own view is that our government, in their strategies for the management of COVID-19, should include this aspect, particularly for the marginalized communities, because if we are talking about children who are going to be taught remotely, that will remain hollow for our marginalized communities that do not have access to affordable and universal internet. So that's important. And I think another issue that is quite important, particularly at this point in time in the declaration, is the inclusion of privacy and protection of personal information, particularly issues dealing with the need to protect the issues relating to surveillance. You would be aware that at this point in time in the management of COVID-19, the regulations that have been introduced or made under the Disaster Management Act introduce maybe what I can call a limitation to many of our human rights, including the right to privacy, because you would know that one of the regulations allow tracing of people who have been infected and their contacts, as well. Collection of a whole host of personal information, and also the sharing of that personal information with the National Department of Health, and the further processing of that personal information. And we need to be alert, because what's going to happen after COVID Of course, there is a clause that says that the information will only be used for the purpose of the management of the pandemic. But what will happen after the pandemic to that information? Issues of de-identification, destruction of that information come to the fore. So it means that as human rights activists, we have to be alert and ensure that post-COVID, we ensure that our rights remain protected. I am saddened, and this is my last point, saddened by the fact that in the regulations, there is no role for the information regulator, which I had. I do welcome the appointment in the South African context of our former judge of the Constitutional Court to monitor the implementation of the regulation relating to privacy and protection of personal information. But I would have been pleased if the role of the information regulator was recognized in this regard, particularly because the information regulator came up with a guidance note on the protection of personal information in the management of COVID-19. That's my last point, and thank you very much.
Wow, brilliant. Thank you for that. And I think there were a lot of head noddings going on with many of the points you made, but particularly around the rather tragic omission of the information regulator advocate. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll get a little bit more on that as we go along. All right, moving along, Justine, you're up.
So I've been asked to talk about two particular things. One is just how should foundational principles that are underlying this new updated version, as well as looking at the provisions around the internet. Now, I'm not going to deal with each and every one, obviously, of the new foundational principles, which are set out in a new Part 1 entitled General Principles. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to cherry pick the ones that I think are most noteworthy and are most likely to be of benefit to human rights defenders and people in the media. And Pansy, please, advocate, if I leave anything out, if I say something that you think's an incorrect interpretation, we're all new on this document, so please feel free to jump in. So the first thing I want to look at is principle number 1, which talks about, which imposes on states parties an enabling environment for access to information and freedom of expression, including protections from non-state parties. Pansy's already alluded to this, but it's really important to note that this now covers acts and omissions by private individuals as well to impede freedom of expression and access to information. The next one I think is going to be particularly useful for anyone who's litigating on freedom of expression, access to information issues is principle number 4. And it contains the principle that the most favorable provision is to prevail in a court context. So what they mean is that if this new declaration, the new AU declaration, has wider protections for you than your own national law, you use the declaration. If the declaration's provisions are more general, and in fact your local law or national law protects you more, then the standard is the national law. So I think that that's going to be really helpful for people when taking, when challenging limitations on freedom of expression. Principle 5 is the next one that I think is really important, and that has the principle that you need the protections that you give offline to freedom of expression and access to information apply online too. In other words, there's no distinction between online and the real world, between print media and online media, between broadcasting online and print. The next one, principle 6, is it gives protection to human rights defenders, the same level of protection as are given to journalists and others actually working in the media. And this is very important because it means that there's a certain level of protection given to NGOs and NPOs that are working to support freedom of expression and access to information. And then the last one I want to point out from the general principles is that there are now very detailed provisions around limitations. It's much broader than the 2002 version, which spoke about best efforts. States must give best efforts for practical effect. Now, the limitations are really, you know, they've got to be in law, they've got to be clear, precise, accessible, and foreseeable. In other words, you can't have a retrospective application of limitations. There's got to be a legitimate aim, and these are very clearly set out. The rights and reputations of others, to protect national security, public order or public health. They've got to be necessary and they've got to be proportionate. These are really important provisions that will help to the courts to determine whether or not a restriction on freedom of expression is justifiable. These are really important developments. The other thing that I think is critically important, and I'm going to go straight from the beginning to the very end of the document, is part 5 of the document that talks about implementation. And it specifically requires states to adopt legislative, administrative, judicial, and other measures to give effect to the declaration. It specifically enjoins states, entreats states, requires states to use the model law of access to information and the model law on access to information and elections. So those are two different model laws, one dealing with elections specifically, the other dealing more generally with access to information. And really importantly, for me, one of the highlights of the new declaration is the principle that says that states must provide detailed information on the measures taken to facilitate compliance with the provisions of this declaration when they make their reports to the African Commission in terms of Article 2 of the African Charter, Article 62 of the African Charter. And this is a way that we're going to be able to also hold governments to account. That we're going to be saying, well, what have you done in terms of making sure that your public broadcasters are genuine public broadcasters and not state broadcasters? And now there's going to be very detailed provisions in those reports. So hopefully we'll really see some movement. Okay, and then very quickly moving on to freedom of expression and access to information on the internet. This is a whole new section. There's a whole new part 4 now of the principles that relate directly to information. And I'm going to start with principle 38. States must recognize that universal, equitable, affordable, and meaningful access to the internet is necessary for the realization of freedom of expression, access to information, and the exercise of other human rights. It requires states to develop independent and transparent regulatory mechanisms for oversight. It requires improving infrastructure for universal coverage. It requires regulating market competition to support lower pricing and encourage diversity, and promote local access initiatives such as community networks and facilitating digital literacy skills. The next principle that's really important, principle 38 on non-interference. It specifically prohibits states from using blocking or filtering mechanisms for internet content unless this is justifiable and is compatible with international human rights standards. It specifically says no disruption of access to the internet and other digital technologies for segments of the public or for an entire population. So internet blackouts, brownouts, shutdowns, closing WhatsApps, closing Facebook and Twitter, for example, those are simply not condoned, not allowed. And they also have a very important provision around economic measures such as taxes, levies, and duties, saying that these can only be imposed if they do not undermine affordable and meaningful access to the internet. And we've seen a lot of these lately. Taxes imposed in Uganda and Tanzania, for example, that are just way too high and actually entirely prevent people from then being able to use the internet properly. And then lastly, is there provisions? I'm not going to talk about surveillance and personal information because Avni's going to do that. I'm just focusing more generally. Lastly, Principle 39 deals with internet intermediaries. It requires internet intermediaries not to interfere with the free flow of information by blocking or giving preference to certain internet traffic. It provides that states shall not require internet intermediaries to proactively monitor content. It also requires states to ensure that internet intermediaries that engage in moderating or filtering online content must mainstream human rights safeguards, and they must adopt mitigation strategies to address restrictions on freedom of expression and ensure transparency on requests for removal, that these incorporate appeal mechanisms and other effective remedies to combat rights violations. States must not be able to require the removal of online content by internet intermediaries unless the requests are imposed by an independent and impartial judicial authority. And even though law enforcement agencies can act in an emergency on grounds a real risk of death or serious harm, that requirement has to be subject to judicial review. So these are really, really important changes. Lastly, they're also saying that states must ensure that developments and use of AI and algorithms for internet used by internet intermediaries, these must be compatible with international human rights law and standards. These are really groundbreaking, excellent, amazing provisions, and it just means that the 2019 version of the declaration really sort of pushes the declaration, I think, squarely into the 21st century and in line with international human rights law. It really is something to be welcome, and I think it's going to be a game changer, particularly for local level litigation. And one thing that I hope that we see coming out of this, I'd be interested in Pansy's view on this, I hope that this overall Africa-wide declaration, I hope that we see it mirrored in the regional bodies, in SADC, in ECOWAS, COMESA, organizations like that. Thanks, William.
Brilliant. Thank you, Justine. That's fascinating. And I'm sure all of you have already seen that there's a ton of incredible things that are raised. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a few brief inputs from our other panelists. And then I'm going to let them talk among themselves a little bit and question each other and raise some of the other issues. And then we'll go to some of your comments and questions that are there. So let's, just because you're on my top left of my screen, Dure Tsang, let's, we'll take you first. So I've briefed them all to speak for about a 3-minute input, so they can only give very, high-level views of these things. But Dure Tsang is going to talk to some of the broadcasting impacts and importance of this. Zoe's going to talk specifically to some of the issues around general freedom of expression issues within the declaration. and then Avni will talk to some of the issues around the surveillance. And then, as I said, we'll let them raise any points between each other, and then we'll take it from there. Dee?
Cool. Thanks, William. Yeah, so I also just cherry picked like 3 principles, but specifically those that are related to public broadcasting, and I guess by extension also to public service media. And the first obviously is the obvious one, which is Principle 13. For me as a non-legal mind, Principle 13 really is a call to recommit to an independent public interest media, but also public interest media institutions. I think it provides a lot of clarity now in terms of which institutions can be called public broadcasters or public service media and which can't. I think for a long time we've had public broadcasters or radio stations on the continent that masquerade as public service media, and yet if you look through how the boards are appointed, if you look at whether there's independence at the editorial level, if you look at how the governance structures are set up, as well as the role of the regulators in that space, you find that actually, you know, they might not be as 100% independent as we would need them to be in order to fulfill the function of being public service and public interest media. So for me, Principle 13 really is, you know, is something that solidifies what we mean when we say we want to see a public broadcasting or public service media institution, which boxes, if we wanted to tick off, which boxes we would need to tick off. So that's the first one that I wanted to point out. The second was Principle 14, which really looks at private media. But I think for me, this is where the extension into public service media comes in. If you go through Principle 14, you'll see that there's not just an imperative on private media, to be a certain way or to uphold independent media principles, but also to carry public interest media content. And that's a biggie, because you'll find that in some countries, there are regulatory obligations on private media to actually have public interest content. Whereas in other countries, it's a free-for-all, the quotas are too little, and so on and so forth. And so I think as we move into the future, it's going to become more important for private media to also specifically carry public interest content. Why is that important? Private media are most likely to be the guys that go fully digital first. They're most likely to be the guys that embrace AI, machine learning, virtual reality, and all of those new technologies first. So if they're driving the change and they potentially could be causing a digital divide, we need to ensure that even in those spaces, that the majority of the public interest government needs are going to be taken care of. What does that look like specifically? I really don't know. It could be something as simple as imposing and saying, hey, Netflix, you need to carry specific local content and have a segment that, you know, has that speaks to the geography of where you're broadcasting. We have to clarify that. But I think this is a good starting ground in terms of driving a more inclusive, public interest driven and people-centered digital environment, because otherwise everyone's just going to go into their little silos. Netflix will do movies, Showmax will be the only ones that carry local African content, and maybe some other video streaming services will carry content to their specific locales, but no one would look at, even for example, the fact that people need news and information, which we are now seeing is a big need, even for those who are only on the internet and are only using streaming services. They're suddenly having to go back and find free-to-air stations to understand what's going on, for example, in terms of COVID and all of that. So the current time that we're in is reminding us of why we actually have to not only have these provisions, but protect public interest provisions in our media environment. And then the last one was around Principle 24, which really looks at the economic measures and other environmental conditions that states as well as private actors would need to sort of create in order for a thriving independent media sector to exist. And for me, that particular principle is really a call to action and could be the basis of a new social compact in terms of what it is that we want to see in a fully digital media environment. Why do I say that? Because it brings us back to the point of serving the public by enabling public debate and dialogue as journalists, as media practitioners. But it goes beyond putting this imperative on just media institutions. It essentially is also saying that, you know, we need to be creating an enabling financial sector. Yesterday, we were talking just about how decimated a lot of media institutions are in this environment, how news media are struggling financially, how the economies of most countries don't allow for independent and investigative journalism to thrive. And I think for me, it's also about creating a politically and legally open and transparent environment in most countries, so that when we talk about having an independent media environment, when we talk about the private sector coming to the party or non-state actors coming to the party to support an independent media, we know exactly what it is that we're asking them to do. When we start looking at nation by nation provisions of what it is when we say there must be independence between commercial guys versus state guys versus all other interests in order to build an independent media sector, that we sort of have some kind of framework as to what that should look like. And the other big thing around this also, besides it being a basis for a new social compact, I think it also, both within the media development community, but also outside, it really calls on us to go back and recommit to whether or not we want an independent media sector and what that should look like for each of us. But it also allows us to start imagining what the new roles of the different actors can be and should be. So while we are still in a wholly broadcast environment, mainly broadcast environment in many countries, these are things that we can start putting in place now, so that when we do get to a point where we are switching off analog signals, hopefully, God willing, that we have an inclusive and meaningfully accessible media environment that also makes space for public interest content. And by that, we would literally need to be looking at ways in which it's not about the power or the money that you have in your pocket, but rather that there is a space and a place where, as a citizen, as a usual person on the street, you can go and find content and information that takes care of your needs, that looks at your information needs, and it doesn't leave you excluded or on the margins because you couldn't pay for your subscription, or because, you know, the people who are making the content were not thinking about what public interest is. So for me, these principles really are a call towards moving the entire sector back to people-centeredness rather than institution-centeredness or technology-centeredness. And yeah, I think that's about the three main ones.
Yes, I've got to wrap you up now. You kind of went over your time by just a little.
It was 3 points.
Yes, 3 minutes, not 3 points broadly, but thank you. Okay, let's, I can't see Zoe, so, oh, she is there, you are there, but I'm going to just take Avni, because then Zoe, you'll take us back to the broader picture, because Avni's going to talk specifics. Avni, over to you.
Thanks, William. So for me, I think the inclusion of the right to privacy is one of the most exciting developments in the Declaration. As many of you will know, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights doesn't include an express right to privacy. So this is a massive step forward for privacy advocates. And as Justine mentioned, this is now going to be a specific requirement for states to report on their compliance regarding the right to privacy in their state reports to the African Commission, which is a huge development. So as more communications and developments take place online, and our privacy rights become more and more fractured, I think this is a particularly timely document. The principles regarding privacy are set out in Articles 40 to 42, and there are kind of 5 key issues that I want to flag for general discussion. The first part is that the Declaration now recognizes an express right to privacy. It recognizes its role in realizing other rights as well, but as a self-standing right in itself, and gives content to this right including the confidentiality of communications and the protection of personal information. The second aspect is that it recognizes the right to communicate anonymously and use pseudonyms online, which I think is a particularly striking development because it builds on work that the rapporteurs from the United Nations, from the African Commission have done previously, but really codifies it in this document now, and recognizes the importance of anonymity online to be able to express opinions, to be able to engage in searches for information, regardless of other concerns that might arise. It recognizes in this regard that states must not adopt laws and measures that prohibit or weaken encryption as well. So it really takes us forward in terms of technological advancements, and recognizes the importance that technologies such as encryption technologies play, and the impact that things like backdoors have in inhibiting the right to privacy. The third very important point, I think, is that it completely disallows for mass surveillance. And this, I think, is a huge development and really something that really should be welcomed. It states that states shall not engage or condone acts of indiscriminate or targeted collection or other use of personal information. And I think a lot of states are going to have difficulties now, or will have to seriously review their surveillance laws and surveillance practices in line with this declaration. It does allow for targeted surveillance, but again, that's authorized by law and complies with international human rights standards, which I think is an acceptable way in which targeted surveillance can take place. And very importantly, it also puts in place, provides for specific safeguards that must be provided for. So, for example, an independent and impartial oversight body, judicial authority, that authorizes the surveillance. Due process safeguards that allows for it. User notification, which is a huge development and something that many privacy advocates have advocated for. It also provides for the specific circumstances under which surveillance can take place. So it requires that there's a specific and reasonable suspicion that a serious crime has been or is about to be committed, or requires that there's another legitimate aim. So it circumscribes the terms under which surveillance can take place. And lastly, as Advocate Lakula mentioned, the fifth point that I want to mention is that it requires that states provide a legal framework for data protection. And I think that's a key development, as many African states are in the process of enacting laws or have been a little bit slow in enacting it and bringing it into force, South Africa included. I think that this is a huge development in requiring states and recognizing the importance of data protection. It also prohibits the harmful sharing of personal information. So, for example, child sexual abuse material or the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, which is another key development that the declaration recognizes. So I think this is, whilst there are aspects of it that I think could have benefited from a bit more detail, I think that this is a phenomenal starting point in recognizing the right to privacy on the continent. It's going to be a huge development for advocacy, for privacy advocates, especially during this COVID-19 period where privacy is becoming increasingly of concern. And I think really is welcomed and something that we should all try and use to the maximum effect to get states to comply with it. Thanks for that.
So having a bit of a brain fart there. Thank you very much. That's fascinating as always. Lovely points. Looking forward to it. Right, move along to Zoe, please. Your time begins now.
Thank you, William. Undoubtedly, the new declaration is a significant improvement on the 2002 Declaration on Principles, and it strengthens the normative framework for freedom of expression and access to information in Africa. But I think it's important for us to look at the current context, and here, I mean, I draw reference from SADC. Right now, in all SADC countries, aside from Tanzania, I believe, have declared a state of emergency or national disaster. And with that comes restrictions of certain rights, but especially freedom of expression, which should not be amongst those rights. I'm making that distinction because I dare not consider the right to access to information, for example, without looking at the right to freedom of expression. And again, in doing so, it's important then to highlight the role of the media, which is central to facilitating the right to freedom of expression and access to information. There's been a dramatic increase in violations of media freedom in this COVID-19 period, with Zimbabwe being the global leader in this respect, despite the fact that in most countries the media has been recognized as an essential service. And then further extensions on of curbs on free expression now include the circulation of fake news and disinformation, mostly affecting the sharing of information on social media platforms. Interestingly, it is largely media houses and journalists that are facing restrictions in that respect. And it is for this reason that I am therefore particularly pleased that the 2019 declaration articulates very clearly limitations to freedom of expression. It notes, amongst others, that states may only limit the exercise of the right to freedom of expression and access to information if the limitation is prescribed by law, serves a legitimate aim, and is necessary and proportionate means to achieve the stated aim in a democratic society. So moving on, I'll look at the declaration and highlight issues specifically in part 2 of the declaration, freedom of expression. Dudu's already spoken to this, but what immediately jumped out at me is principle 13, public service media. And here, I think it's important to note the intentional phrasing of this principle. The reference to public service media covers all public media, including print, and broadcasting. This is a departure from the 2002 declaration, which did not adequately speak to the expectation of government public print media. The reference there in relating largely to private print media. Also of critical importance here then is the clarification of the public service ambit of public broadcasters. Again, Dudu has spoken to this, which in the 2019 declaration states that states shall be clearly defined and include an obligation to ensure that that the public receive adequate and potentially balanced information, particularly during election periods. That is a critical issue for us on the continent. Then principle 14, dealing with private media. The 2002 declaration did not acknowledge the increasing public interest role, for example, that private media, print, broadcasting, online is playing. I mean, if you were to look just now at how private media have come to the table to support national efforts on COVID-19, it speaks to this role that the private media is playing. Then I am particularly excited about Principle 15 on community media. The 2002 declaration made fleeting reference to community media, stating briefly that it said community media shall be promoted given its potential to broaden access to poor and rural communities to the airwaves. But now the 2019 declaration in this principle provides for comprehensive guidance on states' obligations regarding community media. And here, of particular importance in our context is the reference to the establishment of community media as independent, non-profit entities and regulation of community broadcasting in terms of ownership, management, content, licensing, and importantly, states' obligations with respect to the regulation then of the radio frequency spectrum. For us in Southern Africa, and I'm definitely broader field, this will serve to dramatically, I think, support advocacy and lobbying efforts, especially in countries like Zimbabwe, Botswana, Eswatini, to democratize the licensing regimes for community radio. And a particular favorite of mine in this declaration is Principle 16 on self-regulation and co-regulation. 2002 declaration stated that a public complaint system for print or broadcasting should be available, and then it references effective self-regulation as the best system for promoting high standards in the media. And this has probably been, that singular statement has probably been the foundation of all media campaigns in support of self-regulatory mechanisms and the associated complaints bodies. Now, the 2019 declaration notes co-regulation to complement self-regulation founded on informed collaboration between stakeholders. I propose here that you read that Principle 16 along with Principle 18, which clarifies how public complaints systems for print, broadcast, online media, and internet intermediaries should be established, governed, and how they should function. Also, much emphasis is placed on the 2019 declaration through Principle 20, which speaks to the safety of journalists and other media practitioners. And I mean, I'm referencing that because, I mean, yesterday we celebrated World Press Freedom Day, and we were again reminded of the difficult circumstances in which journalists work. So this is a dramatically expanded feature in the 2019 declaration, and it's evident of the strong lobby on this issue, driven by the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. It speaks broadly to the UN Plan, along with the implementation strategy, which proposes principles for cooperation and possible practical actions. Now that I think that it has now been more broadly articulated in the 2019 declaration, I'm confident that it will support country level campaigns, which again, by the way, is encouraged by the UN plan. The declaration speaks to economic measures. I'll not go into that. Dudu has elaborated on that. I mean, which is critical, especially since, I mean, the word is that news media as we know it will be extinct soon. The need for support for sustainable, independent public service media is of critical importance, and now the speech again draws extensively from the Tshwane principles, and then implementation, which is a game changer here, but I'll go into that because I think Justine clarified that quite well. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant input. I want to just I know that the speakers have been able to follow the comments. I've asked some of them to engage with some of them. Which one of you wants to go first? I'm going to keep you to like 30 seconds. Justine, is that you getting ready to talk? Or Avni? Which one of you? Avni? Okay, you go.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Advocate Lakula.
No, you know, I didn't follow the comments, but I want to make a general point. Look, implementation is going to be very important because this declaration is not a silver bullet for anything. All of us have to make sure that when our countries submit their reports, we have to submit shadow reports, because without that, this declaration will not go anywhere. The issue also of advocacy is extremely important, particularly on issues of privacy, because privacy is not in the charter, as Avni has said. So we have to ensure that we put privacy on the agenda of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, because as we speak, even with this declaration, privacy is not on the agenda. So we have to find strategies to put privacy on the agenda of the African Commission.
Thank you, Advocate. Justine, do you want to just take the other questions that speak a little bit more about integration of some of the elements? I don't know if you, from what
Yes, absolutely. And maybe I can start reviewing our own access to information legislation, which is now, you know, nearly 20 years old. I definitely think that it's going to be very important to go through all of the provisions on access to information in this declaration with a fine-tooth comb, and to cross-reference our existing provisions with the model law. Now, we've started looking at that. I think I have to say that I do think it's fair to say, Pansy, please jump in if what I'm saying is rubbish, but it does seem to me that the model law is based quite a lot on our access to information legislation as it is. So if the model law is based on that, you can't really change it back. You need to go through it to check where things have been updated, where there are additional provisions. We need to put those in. And then we need to be very careful with the advocacy around that. I think to work with the information regulator, also to work with the Department of Justice and frankly, Foreign Affairs, or whoever it is that is responsible for doing our Article 62 reports to the African Commission, to say, here are the changes that we think we need to see to bring the our own Promotion of Access to Information Act really up to date. And that's bearing in mind that a number of amendments have already been made to it which are still not yet enforced, because the PUPI Act is not yet in force. So we've got to just, it's always a bit of a moving target, but I totally agree, Isak, we've got to make sure that if we're making recommendations for amendment, they include the important things here, particularly around internet access and promoting transparency.
Thank you. Avni?
Thanks, William. I just want to echo Charlie's point about, some of the key issues that we're concerned about now are, there's a lot of speculation about the different types of technologies being used and what they're being used for and ulterior motives. But I think we have some real core problems that we're already aware of, and communication surveillance being one of them. We know it's taking place, and we really need to make sure that we put in place appropriate safeguards. In South African context, we'll know that this is an issue that's already being litigated around the regulation of Intersection of Communications Act. And I think this declaration will be a very useful tool when it comes to revising that. Similarly, with regard to contact tracing apps that are being used, process of contact tracing in the context of COVID-19, I think these principles will be particularly useful as we assess their compliance with international human rights standards, and make sure that it doesn't persist past the COVID-19 pandemic period. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you. I'll see you, Justine, and I'll come to you now. I'm going to just take Dere Tsang quick.
I see there's a question.
Comrade, no 5 points in 10 minutes style.
No. I don't have 5 points.
Seconds.
I was actually just going to agree with Pippa that it's quite like freaky that the SABs and current affairs offerings. And I think it's probably something that we're going to have to take up, particularly because so many people need critical information and they need it in their languages, especially. So yeah, that's all. See.
Short and sweet.
There we go. I wanted to just stress on the COVID-19 regs. Of course, we have two different sets, don't we? And this is a real problem, because the Minister of Communications issued her own policy directions on track and trace that had no safeguards. And then the original COVID-19 regs put out by the Minister of Cogta, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, were amended to, in fact, provide for some more protections. I agree with Pansy. I think it's very sad that they didn't provide a proper role for the information regulator. And, but nevertheless, the judge is still there. But those did not result result in an amendment to the policy directions issued by the now on leave Minister of Communications. And I think that's a real problem. I think that I understand that COVID-19 is an emergency situation. I understand that government needs to act quickly, but it clearly saw that there was a problem there, and it should have repealed the policy directions which were completely overbroad and unconstitutional.
Thank you. Zoe, do you want to just add anything, any comments on the things that have been raised? Because I'm going to have to just start getting people to wrap up.
A final comment in a very short one. I take note of what Advocate Akula said, and I fully agree with her. This really requires action on the part of civil society, media lobby groups, really to take it on. And I don't want to make this as, based on the comments, a discussion on what is happening in South Africa. We need to come together as a continental group and first, most probably, map where the continent is in relation to what the declaration is proposing, and then use that as a starting point to go forward. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd love this to carry on, and perhaps we can after a few minutes after one, but I'm conscious, people, it's a busy Monday. There have been some great comments there in the comment section. The section is being recorded, so we will make it available to people. I know some had to leave. Thanks, Mike, for your input as well, and your comments about regulatory community media needing more than just regulatory support. I think that's why you really need to make sure that you join the session that is being run tomorrow. It's the third and final version in this current series of webinars hosted by the partners. Just one more point before I hand over to Samkelo to do the thanks and the wrap up, which is the inclusion of digital literacy, which I think is really also a huge and significant step forward that really I think is something that we should all be really proud about. But thank you so much for joining us. Samkelo, over to you to do the thanks.
Yes, I am.
Samkelo, are you still with
yes,
us?
I'm very sorry. The camera issues, I'm not very visible. But this is just to say thank you to the presenters. Very insightful presentations, and ones that set us on a particular path to make the aim of this declaration a reality. But as soon as people start litigating, as soon as people start challenging government, as soon as people start lobbying their own government and looking at legislation, that's where we are going to be proven either wrong or right, that this is a tool that's going to.
But thank you very much. It's been fantastic having you all. Please join us tomorrow, same code, same time, 12 o'clock. And that's going to be another cracker of a session with some amazing speakers. Thank you for our presenters. Those are all really inspirational and excellent. Thank you very much.